Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Sarah and I are excited to tell you about some of the work we've been doing with open space committees and volunteer land trusts and community opinion leaders over the last number of years. And really, what we see is the really critical role they play in land protection across the state. But they haven't necessarily gotten, I think, the focus um, that would allow them to maximize their potential as a complementary piece of the land protection landscape across Massachusetts. So I'm going to start the presentation this afternoon by providing just some background information and sort of some foundational ideas. And then Sarah is going to be kind enough to provide more detail about the specifics of the work we've been doing. It's not a big crowd. I know some of you, most of you maybe, but I was hoping you could just type into the chat what you see as your primary role. You know, if you see yourself as, you know, an employee of a land trust, or maybe you're a natural resource professional, or maybe you're on an open space committee. But if you could list that would be helpful. That would be give Sarah and I a little sense of sort of who's in the room as we talk. And emphasize certain points. So you can go ahead and enter that in the chat, I guess. While you're doing that, I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see that okay? Outstanding. Thank you. So we call this the Open Space Network. And as I said, you know, we're really reaching out to open space committees. But we use that term open space committee in a little bit of a broad way because different communities define their open space committee in different ways. And a lot of times communities may have a formal open space committee. Sometimes it's informal. Sometimes it's a volunteer land trust that sort of fills that role. Sometimes it's just a group of committed community opinion leaders. So it really is sort of an amorphous term. But that's sort of the population that we're striving to reach through our work. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to give you a little bit of background first. You know, all of you probably know this, but we're a heavily forested state, 8th most forested state in the country by percentage of area. We're also the 3rd most densely populated state. So we've got a lot of forests. We've got a lot of people that depend on those forests. Of course, I'm preaching to the choir, but you all know how much our forests provide us in terms of essential benefits, both public benefits from public water supplies to climate change mitigation, recreation, biodiversity, wood products. More and more, we're recognizing the human health benefits, just the sort of scenic backdrops and so forth to our lives. So, you know, our landscapes want to be forests. We have a lot of them right now, and they provide a lot of essential benefits. Who is primarily providing those benefits, you ask? Well, that is mostly private landowners. So about 70% of our ownerships are in private ownerships. Most of those are what we would call family forest ownership. So they're owned primarily by husband and wives, you know, couples, and you know, parcel sizes ranging from a few acres to hundreds of acres across the state. So when we talk about land protection, we're really talking about almost this jigsaw puzzle of parcels across the landscape that when we talk about, you know, the essential benefits we seek to continue, whether it be water quality or wildlife or recreation, they exist at scales, you know, beyond most parcel sizes. So it really is sort of this jigsaw puzzle of landowners, but it's these landowners that are really the essence of land protection. And there are a lot of, you know, good and important conversations about things ranging from funding to how do you write an easement, or how do you steward the easement, and lots of great and important things. But at the end of the day, the first step, the basis of all of this are landowners, as they own most of the land in Massachusetts, and it all mostly is forested. The average age of landowners in Massachusetts, and this is common throughout the United States of private landowners, is over 60 years old. It's close to 65. And when you take a look at the National Woodland Owner Survey in Massachusetts, almost 3/4 of the landowners of the parcels in Massachusetts are owned by people over 55 years old. So we are in the midst of the largest intergenerational transfer of land that our country and our state has ever seen. And the decisions, of course, these landowners are making will determine the future benefits or not that we all receive from these lands, primarily forested. So I give you that background in part, I guess because I'm a forester and a tree hugger, but also because our funding for our work comes from the Working Forest Initiative. And I wanted to both provide a thank you to Massachusetts DCR's Service Forestry Program for providing this funding, but also, sort of provide the background and the framework for why they're providing this funding. So there's a program called the Working Forest Initiative, and the goal of that is to keep forest as forest, providing these great essential benefits and promoting excellent stewardship of those lands to both enhance and diversify the benefits coming from those lands. So we're grateful for Massachusetts DCR for the funding, and of course, now that you've had those introductory slides, you see how important those forest lands are, and you see how important those landowner decisions are. There are actually, at least currently, 3 programs within the Working Forest Initiative, including the Forest Stewardship Program. There's a Foresters for the Birds. Those are both excellent programs that focus mostly on the stewardship piece. And then our piece is that keeping forest as forest piece. So we call this the conservation-based estate planning piece of the Working Forest Initiative. And this is something that we've been doing now for over 10 years. I guess in plain language, when people ask me what conservation-based estate planning is, I guess this is sort of what I default to. We're seeing tremendous shifts in ownership. We're not like the tsunami's not out on the horizon. We're standing in the middle of it. So we currently and in the future will see these big shifts in ownership. And what we're trying to help do is to inform landowners' decisions, their options, to keep as much land and forest as possible, and to keep it in as big of a parcel as possible. So in short, we're trying to keep it in forest and intact, reduce the conversion, reduce the parcelization. And I know this is a land protection conference, but recognize with our conservation-based estate planning piece, we're looking at all kinds of tools. And we recognize that most of those are not permanent, but we want to help landowners pass their land on to heirs or get that to another owner, as I said, in as big of a parcel as possible and as much forest as possible. So if that means good communication, we want to help you with that. If that means, writing a will that's competent and legal and passes on your goals, that's great. We want to help you with that. If it's a trust, if it's an LLC, if it's current use program, if it's a conservation restriction, or if it's a fee simple donation or sale, there's a continuum of ways, of tools, of course, that landowners can use. And we talk about that continuum. We host different programs on that. And of course, those are not mutually exclusive tools, as you all know, so they can be combined in various combinations to meet landowners' goals. And that's what we do with the conservation-based estate planning. We've been doing it since about 2009. So we've been doing it for a number of years now. It's a statewide program, though, however, based on the funding, as I talked about, the Working Forest Initiative, we do, sort of focus in on the most heavily forested regions. So, just generally speaking, Worcester County West, the Cape, and Plymouth County tend to be, areas that we focus on. However, we have done, programs and sent resources and things all across the state. Our target audience, of course, are family forest owners. They're landowners. They're the people that actually are making those decisions. So the real sort of nuts and bolts at the core of what we do is really focused in on those landowner decisions. But we also recognize and recognize very quickly that in order to have the benefit that we hope to have, we can't just go out and talk to landowners. There's just not enough of us around. And the most effective and efficient piece of that would be to sort of train the trainers, go work with those people that are working with landowners as a complementary piece to our efforts. So we work with landowners, but also those people working with them in a train the trainers kind of way. And I hope you've at least seen or heard some of the stuff we've done, including writing Protecting Your Legacy, a guide for landowners, we're in the process of doing a webinar series, which has been really successful and drawn a lot of people from around the state and around the country. So we do a number of activities. Be happy to answer questions about those, but that's not the focus of today. You know, we recognize that landowners are this key audience, and so to better, you know, target our limited time, energy, and resources, you know, we try to seek to understand how landowners are making those decisions and where we can strategically invest our time and money and efforts to help them make those. So understanding those decisions are important. And when we talk about land protection and things, a lot of people sort of default to this, right? That the science of conservation is you know, like, where are the critters moving and how big of a habitat do they need? But you know, when you overlay the parcel maps on some of these, you know, biomap, you know, 3 core areas and other habitat features or public water supplies, you quickly see each one of those polygons, of course, being someone's property, the incredible complexity of that social piece, that social dynamic of the decisions they're making are really driving, you know, what we can do for land protection. And so understanding them is really critical. And of course, that's where I spend, you know, some of my time at UMass, is on that, you know, quote unquote, the other science, which is the social science piece, not the ecological science piece, but how people communicate, how they share information, how they make decisions, both community leaders and landowners, but also increasingly so how families play out, how their dynamics play out. So this is an important foundation that we can use. And so how do landowners make decisions? I would describe it sort of from our research and our experience in a couple different ways. It's very clear that when we do surveys, landowners tell us all across the country over and over again, they own their land for the amenity values. They like the privacy, they like the beauty, they like the recreation, you know, they like not seeing their neighbor. So most landowners are just enjoying their land on a day-to-day basis. We know from things like number of conservation restrictions, number of forest management plans, you know, many landowners aren't planning ahead. They're enjoying their life. I hope they are. They're enjoying their land, you know, they're living their lives. And decisions sort of pop up infrequently. They're sort of triggered by, could be a sickness in the family, could be a knock on the door offering money for land or timber. But on a day-to-day basis, they're pretty much just enjoying their land for the amenity values, and the decisions are infrequent. And because they haven't planned ahead, they're often reactive decisions. It's, oh man, this happened, you know, now I've got to make a decision. Do I sell my land or not? Do I sell my timber or not? And so they often are making those decisions without the benefit of the full range of options. In fact, one of the ways we're fond of describing landowner decisions is like the land is like insurance policy. It's sort of there. People don't think about it on a day-to-day basis, but every once in a while you get into a fender bender or something happens to your house, and you're sure glad you've got that insurance policy, and you can back up and, you know, use that as a backup. But on a day-to-day basis, people sort of don't think about their land, only when it's triggered. We do know that when decisions are made, that, you know, the top source of information tends to be friends and neighbors, that they turn to their friends and neighbors to help them make these decisions. And why they're friends and neighbors? Well, they're friends and neighbors because they're trusted. You know, they don't work for the university, or, you know, have sort of a financial interest in your decision. There's someone that you've had a long relationship often. So they're people that are trusted. They're unbiased. Typically, again, they don't have an interest in, you know, if you're going to sell your land or not, or donate your land or not. So they're seen as an unbiased form of information. Oftentimes, landowners and neighbors, we seek out those people that have firsthand experience. So did you do a conservation restriction? Have you ever, you know, worked with that land trust over there? What kind of experience did you have? Are they good people or not? So we look to people to find out if they had a good experience, a bad experience, what they would do the same, what they would do differently. Our friends and neighbors know local information. You know, if you call me from a town, I can give you some very general information about forests. I can give you some general information about the current use program and conservation restrictions, but your friends and neighbors that live in that town can actually give you specific information about your locale. Friends and neighbors know us. That's probably why we're friends, is that we share a similar ethic, we share a similar world outlook, and so they know our situation. They may know our family situation. They may know our financial situation. Share our values, and friends are around. It's not often maybe at least in my life, I don't run into a lot of experts on a day-to-day basis. So our friends and neighbors are people we see. We have coffee with, or we run into them at a soccer game or around town, or driving down the road and we stop and have a conversation. So these friends and neighbors are available for these time sensitive decisions. So there are a lot of good reasons why landowners primarily seek these people out. There are a couple of concepts I want to lay on you right now, and then Sarah will sort of demonstrate those in the quote unquote real world and what we've been doing. But in every community, of course, we all have our friends and neighbors. And if you were to combine those friends and neighbors and list everybody you knew on a piece of paper, that would be your social network. That would be everybody that you knew. And this is one research methodology, mapping out social networks. Well, if you combined everybody's social networks within a community and added up all of those relationships people have with one another, that would be what we call social capital. And every community has social capital. Every community has financial capital. Every community has natural resource capital, right? Some have high or low resource capital. And some communities, believe it or not, have high and low social capital. And this is something that's been quantified. And communities with higher social capital have better health outcomes, happier people. But there's also a conservation, I think, aspect to this. One of the things we know about social capital is that people engage in what we call norms of reciprocity. So if your snowblower kicks it the morning of a big snowstorm, and I come over and plow your driveway or shovel you out, it's probably likely that the next time something happens, you'll be inclined to help me. This is just what we do as friends and neighbors. There are these norms of reciprocity. I help you, you help me. These relationships have real value, and it plays out in conservation as well. So here's our landowner, the Bortons, and they're embedded within their community, and those lines represent relationships. Well, in this picture, in this slide, they have relationships with two people. And so those two groups of people can offer them information and engage in these norms of reciprocity. But imagine if our friends, the Bortons, were making a decision and had all of these relationships. Imagine that they were able to leverage everyone's knowledge, everyone's experience, everyone's insights and connections and so forth. They'd be in a much stronger position to make a decision that's right for them, right? We're increasing the social capital. And what gets floated around that social, in those networks? There are two kinds of knowledge that gets floated around. I'm going to finish with these two slides, and then I promise I'll stop being geeky. Two different kinds of knowledge that go around these networks. The first is what we call explicit knowledge. And this knowledge is something you can write down. It's codified, right? You can document it, you can store it. A conservation restriction is. The tax break for donating a CR is. These are sort of factual things that you can look up, you can Google. And we get this information typically from people that we know, but we don't know very well. We call those people weak ties. And so a professional is actually a good example. So there's me holding the microphone up there trying to help people, and I'm largely communicating explicit knowledge. However, there's another form of knowledge called tacit knowledge, which you can only gain through experience. And it's hard to articulate. You can't really write it down. You can sort of share your experience in a story or a conversation. An example might be, this is why I conserved my land. This is why I chose to do a CR. These are sort of things that are hard to write down. You sort of have to engage in a conversation about that. And those are things that we typically do with people that we know very well, that we feel comfortable with, that we'll open up to, that we'll share, sort of a personal story with. And this is, sort of bringing it all together. I was doing a focus group of landowners, and we were asking them how they make decisions about their land. And, landowners were talking and we were taking notes and things. And one of the women, there was this pause, in the conversation. One of the women, sort of broke the pause and said, I need the information and I need a friend to talk to about it. And it was this sort of lightning bolt moment for me where I realized, it's both, right? It's the codified and it's the tacit. We need the information. You got to make an informed decision. You got to know what an easement is. You got to know the tax implications to it. But importantly, we also need that complementary piece, right? We need to sort of digest it. We want to know what other people have done and how they felt about it. Other people like us, our friends and our neighbors and so forth. And so we seek out both the, professionals who often give codified knowledge, but that could also be friends and neighbors that know something. And then we certainly seek out those around us for that tacit piece to talk about it in order to make that decision. This is just one more little piece here that I love to present. This is from our former colleague Dave Kittredge and one of our colleagues out at University of Wisconsin. They did this landowner survey, and then they did a statistical logit model to determine if there was a characteristic of a landowner that predicted whether or not they were open to conservation or not. And this is stuff we do all the time. So if they've got a high amount of education, are they open to conservation? Or if they own big amounts of land, are they open to conservation? Or if they joined, their local land trust, does that predict that they'll be open to conservation? And when they ran the statistics, the data that they collected suggested that the strongest predictor of whether or not the landowner was open to conservation or not was that they knew their neighbors, which is just, I love that. We don't know what it means necessarily, but we know that it's a predictor. So I close this piece of my presentation with the idea that these relationships matter, social capital matters, okay? So I just want to take a minute to describe, because this is going to set up more specifically what Sarah and I have been up to. So the conservation land protection sort of landscape, right, across the state is that we've got these wonderful statewide land trusts. We've got NEF, we've got Mass Audubon, we've got TNC, we've got these great organizations. We also have Mass Wildlife. We also have, DCR. We have these regional land trusts. Okay, so we've got the Franklin Land Trusts of the world and BNRC and our sponsors, Go Greenbelt. But we also have, and we sort of focus on, I think my perception is, I think we focus sort of on that statewide and that regional piece. But we've got this other group that these local land trusts volunteer, these open space committees / recreation committees / community leaders that are really interested and engaged and want to do more. And I would suggest that as you move, from local to statewide, you increase the amount of capacity, right? TTOR has more capacity and expertise than the local open space committee in general. I would also suggest, though, as you move from statewide to local, there's more local knowledge, right? That's a truism, and stronger relationships at the local level at this, at this sort of this level. And to me, to us, we sort of haven't I think, drawn a circle around this group and given an identity and cultivated this as a complement, not a substitution, as a complement for all the other, great work that's happening at the statewide and regional level. These people play a unique role in land protection. They're the people that, are the friends and neighbors. They're the ones people are going to for information. They hear about, things happening first. Usually they know when the farm's coming up for sale because someone passed away or got divorced. They're that trusted source of information that can tell you what's happening with the landowner or what's happening in that town. They're the one the landowner turns to because they know them and they're credible. They can connect landowner and professional. They can convene a meeting, whether it's over, apple pie and coffee or a walk in the woods. They can facilitate projects. They can support projects. They can be the advocate at town meeting. They can be the partner on a grant. So these people, these local groups, play a role that I think we all recognize as being significant, but I don't know how much time and energy, we sort of have focused on that. And so that sort of tees up Sarah. So, each of those levels, so to speak, and I didn't mean to create a hierarchy, but each of those levels has a really important role to play, including, the open space committees, the volunteer land trust, and the community leaders, sort of writ broadly as a group. And so the question we've been asking over the last few years is, how do we provide folks at that local level with the knowledge, with the confidence, and the resources they need to maximize their impact and complement, the
You teed me up on a cliffhanger. Okay, well, I think we lost Paul, but that was his last slide before the transition, where he's talking about now that we've switched gears and we're thinking about open space committees in particular. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my presentation, and hopefully Paul will be able to join us in a second. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, excellent. So I'm Sarah Wells. I work at Mount Gray's Land Conservation Trust over in North Central Massachusetts. And my introduction to the work of open space committees came back when I was an AmeriCorps member. And I was trying to help the town of Barry's open space committee with putting together their open space and recreation plan. And I remember that the more I got to know that crew and got a sense of the depth of their collective knowledge about their community and their neighbors, it was really stunning. And part of the reason it was stunning was because I grew up just a couple towns away from Barry, and I realized that I had no idea how much conservation activity had been happening around me. And I really had no idea that the invisible infrastructure that was enabling all of that conservation was actually all about relationships. And that relationship piece has been baked into the type of outreach that Paul had been doing for years before I came on the scene with his previous partners, Wendy Sweetser Ferris and Jay Raskew, who some of you may have had the opportunity to know, where they had focused for a long time on that peer-to-peer element. So when we decided to start to engage with open space committees more deliberately, it seemed like a no-brainer that we would try to employ that same peer-to-peer model. So we had this first open space conference that we put together in 2011, and it was very important to us that this conference have a free registration, because we knew at the time that there were other conferences and trainings already in existence that touched on conservation. But we really wanted this to be rooted in peer-to-peer, have as little to no barriers as possible for entry, and to be really tailored to folks who are trying to work on the most local of scales. And fortunately, we had some funding through that Working Forest initiative that Paul talked about earlier. So we were able to set up a structure that was pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and really all about just trying to amplify the firsthand stories of people who are just trying to do good work in their towns. We had 60 people come to that first conference, and I remember that feeling like a huge win. And the thing that I remember most strongly is just there was a real sense of joy. And that's not always the overriding emotion that I pick up on when I'm at a conference, but at this one, people just seem so genuinely happy to be there and to be talking with each other and sharing what they had learned, what was working, what was not working, and that was very motivating for me. When I was looking back at photos from that first conference, this one stuck out to me. And I'll admit, at first it was because I think Paul and I, Paul especially, we just, look like babies. So that's what first drew my attention. But then I noticed what the heading was on that whiteboard. How can open space committees be the most effective? And that's really one of the core questions that's been guiding this municipal outreach work that we've been doing really for the past decade. How can open space committees be the most effective? And importantly, what is our role? So coming from an academic institution and a land trust, how do we support their efforts to be most effective? And how do we do that so that it's mutually beneficial and it taps into that reciprocity that Paul was talking about earlier? So through our conversations with people over the past decade, we found that the types of support that we hear that people really want tends to fall in one of these three categories: training, funding, networking. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about some of the ways that we've experimented in our outreach across those three categories. And there's overlap, of course. I mean, even with that open space conference that I've already started talking about, from the very get-go, it was about both training and networking. And we've been able, thankfully, to do 6 additional statewide free open space conferences since that first one in 2011. And our ability to put on these conferences is really driven by the funding and the capacity. And on the capacity side, I think it's really important to note that behind each of the 7 conferences has been a team of AmeriCorps members. It used to be a program called MassLift. That's what Lee, who's on the call, and I did. It's now known as TerraCorps. And they're really they were the invisible infrastructure, so to speak, behind these conferences, and the success of them is a testament to their organization, but really their community building and putting together these conferences. Each year, we noticed that the conference was growing a little bit, and because it was, but on the same token, it was small enough that people were usually game for, at the end of the day, taking a group photo. And by the time that we hit 2019, we had officially hit the 100-person threshold, which again felt really exciting for us. And we were starting to see that we were truly starting to pull people from across the state. So we had people coming from Pittsfield to Falmouth in this conference in 2019. And I wanted to show this photo because one of the fun things that we would try to do is we would put a little bit of money toward buying raffle items. And we were trying to buy things that we thought would be immediately useful to the Open Space Committee type people who are coming to these conferences. So we would get things like these loppers. And we were deliberate in that there was no financial part of this. People didn't have to buy a raffle ticket. Just by virtue of physically showing up to the conference, you got your name on a raffle ticket. But the catch is that we made sure not to pull the winners until the very, very end of the conference. That was our fun little hook for getting people to stay toward the end. And the only rule is that you had to physically be there in order to claim your prize. And the very last thing that we would raffle a few years in a row was a handheld GPS unit. And I thought that would go over well, but there were a few times where by the time we got to the GPS unit, people were standing up and clapping and cheering for whoever ended up winning it. And then that was the end of the conference, and we'd go outside and we'd take a group photo. And I'm saying all that to share that the way that these conferences happen just embody this idea of relationship building and enjoying time spent with people who care about similar things and want to move that work forward. So we were feeling really good and positive and putting together our planning for the 2020 conference. And around March, we had nailed down all of the final logistics, and then everything changed. Schools were closed, offices were closed. COVID, March 2020, became the #1 thing on everyone's radar. At that point, I think that the TerraCorps team organizing the conference had every reason to say, you know what, this is too much. We spent the last 5 months planning an in-person conference that can't happen. So we're just gonna call it a loss and try again next year. But they didn't do that. In a matter of weeks, they turned this whole in-person conference into a webinar series. And I think it's a little harder, at least for me, to appreciate that now, because I'm used to, now Zoom is a part of my daily life. But back in April of 2020, some of us, myself included, were using Zoom for the very first time. So while it may not seem like a very big deal to change a whole conference from in-person to Zoom, it was a big deal in 2020. And it was a success, again, because those AmeriCorps members cared and they were able to to work with the speakers and have the participants still show up to pull off what was ultimately still another successful conference. By 2021, fortunately / unfortunately, given what had changed and not changed with the pandemic, we knew ahead of time that the whole conference would be via Zoom, and that afforded one big advantage, that we could plan our budget differently, because having it over Zoom dramatically reduced the cost of doing the conference. So we were able to invest some funding in something we hadn't done before, where we paid for the workshops to be translated into Spanish and to have some of the accompanying workshop materials translated into Spanish. And those are still available on a website that I'll talk about in a little bit as well. It's called massopenspace.org. And we felt, we have some available funding. What's something that we can do to try to make this conference more inclusive? And that leads us to the most recent conference series that just started, or excuse me, just finished in March. And maybe some of you had a chance to participate in that. And actually it was in February. I forget that we're already in March now, but they just finished this. It went really well. We saw our highest number of attendees yet, where we had nearly 300 people tune in to the month-long webinar series. But our metric of success for this work has never been just about numbers. We think that's important, of course, but that's not how we measure success. What's more important to us is that we know who's actually coming, and is the information that we're providing helping them to ultimately be more effective. We were heartened to see that about half of the people who came self-identified as either being with an open space committee or a conservation commission specifically, or they listed their town as their affiliation. And at first, I was a little surprised to see that a full third of the participants identified as being in this other category. But then I saw the sampling of the organizations that comprise that other category. And for me, it again reinforced the idea that we're reaching the people who we want to reach. And it demonstrates that there's variability and the names of these groups across towns. For example, Carlisle, I didn't know until this year that they had a specific conservation restriction advisory committee. That isn't something that exists across all town governance structures in our state, but it's the analog to the open space committees. And those are the people who we're trying to reach. And we often use open space committees as a shorthand way to really refer to anyone who's volunteering their limited time into trying to advance conservation activities in their hometown. So this was feeling, pretty exciting. For the past 2 years, concurrently, as we've been developing the Open Space Conference, we've also dabbled with putting together specific trainings about what used to be Oliver and is now called Mass Mapper. So that's the free open space mapping program available in Massachusetts. And we kept hearing that people wanted to learn more about how to use it. And I wanted to mention this to you all because it's been striking. Of the 3 that we've had so far, every time we've put it out there into the world that we're hosting this workshop, and by that I mean we're just sending emails, we're not even getting into mailing anything. Each time the registration has been filled within hours. Not days, but within hours. Every spot in these trainings has been filled. And as of today, we have a 65-person wait list for our one remaining session this year. The last piece in the training category that I want to talk about was the Open Space Handbook that we just developed and released within the last year. And we put this together because we wanted to pull together information about landowner decisions, land protection, resources, grant opportunities, and really try to put that into one guide because nothing like that previously existed. There was no statewide support system or group for open space committees in particular. And we were seeing all these commonalities in the types of questions that people have asked of us in the past 10 years. And we wanted the handbook to try to address some of that. This is available, it's free, it's on the Masswoods website. We also have some really nice print versions. If anyone wants them, then we're always happy to get them mailed out to folks if you think they'd be useful. I'm not going to get into every section in depth, but I did want to share a few nuggets about the handbook because we're certainly excited that it's now out in the world. It has 6 sections, and I wanted to mention that we do have 4 case studies of the work that's happening in the local areas, and we found in our previous publications that it's often the case studies where people can find something that resonates to the situation that they might find themselves in their community. The handbook starts off in a way that's a bit similar to what Paul was sharing with us at the beginning of this presentation, with really, setting the stage of the state of conservation in Massachusetts. What are the threats and what are the opportunities and what's the unique role that Open Space Committee type members can play in protecting open space. We couldn't write an open space handbook without talking about open space and recreation plans a bit. So of course we do that, but we also try to take some effort in promoting the idea that there are a lot of different ways to do outreach to get community feedback and to really be creative and trying to get input from as wide of a swath of your community as possible, and not just necessarily to the people who are already most likely to respond to an open space survey that they might get in the mail. Of course, we talk about land protection tools too, because that's really the bread and butter of much of the work that Paul and I do together. But we call out specifically the town of Shelburne and their journey with coming up with and implementing a Chapter 61 right of first refusal policy that we find is perennially relevant in all of our conversations with local open space folks. We have a pretty robust section that talks about funding, and we have this great chart, and it's tailored to a municipal audience, and it lays out the common suite of grant sources that are out there. And we give particular focus in our case study to a relatively new grant program that I'm guessing many of you are already aware of and maybe have already used. It's the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness, or MVP program. And they have funding available to do some important planning work, but also then there's action grants that you can implement key pieces of your community's plan. Now, and finally, we round things off with a section about stewardship, and we have this lovely case study that ties together multiple themes. It's a story of a community trail in Wilbraham and their efforts to bring together the land protection, the funding, and the trail. So hopefully it's obvious that we've really tried to invest a significant amount of our time and our resources into this training bucket, but we certainly recognize that training alone doesn't always translate into action, and certainly money helps. And we've learned that a little bit of money can truly go a long way, especially when we're talking about reaching landowners in the community, the conservation-based estate planning type work that Paul was talking about earlier. So we already know, and Paul talked about this, that the research shows that landowners listen to their friends and neighbors when it comes to making decisions. So we thought it should be a no-brainer to direct some of our resources to those friends and neighbors who are also serving on open space committees and looking to do this type of work. So we started with a Catalyst grant program back in 2015. We didn't have a ton of money, so we decided we can do what we can afford is we can make a set of $350 grants. That first year, those went out to 8 different communities. And it's pretty amazing what they were able to pull off. So they reached collectively hundreds of landowners by mail. But what I wanted to point out is that they were able to reach 89 landowners who actually came to their in-person events. And of those, 19 requested follow-up with the land trust that day. So that's more than 20% of landowners came to the event and that day said, yes, I want to talk to a land trust. As someone who does landowner outreach, that's just staggering to me, because that's not even counting the people who come. So they're already primed to hear something, but then they need to go home and talk to their partner or their decision makers or people on their deed. And it might take a couple weeks, a couple months, a couple years, in some cases, a couple decades before they feel ready to say, yeah, I want to talk to a land trust. But by investing in this group of people, more than 20% of landowners that day said, yes, I want to take the next step and have a conversation with the land trust. We've been able to thankfully expand the pot of money for this catalyst funding a bit over the past few years, especially since 2019, where we're able to give grants that range more between a few $100s, but sometimes have gone up to around $5,000 to help towns and similar type groups, and it can even include land trust. We really love proposals that include a local town board that's working in partnership with the land trust. That's always exciting. We call it the neighborhood outreach project these days, and we typically try to have a grant round that's open in the fall, again, depending on the state of our funding from the Working Forest Initiative. So I just want to mention that we've been able to fund 16 different proposals through this funding in the last few years. And I just want to talk about two of them that I think show some of the spectrum of creativity that we see when these open space committee folks think about, what does it mean to tailor conservation-based estate planning outreach to the people I know, landowners I know in my neighborhood. The Drake-It Open Space Committee, they made a whole documentary that's on YouTube for anyone to watch that celebrates the natural heritage of their town and invites more people to be a part of continuing to conserve that natural heritage. A documentary. And then over in Lincoln, the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust, they had a great idea of putting together a welcome packet so that when people had newly bought land in town and were moving in, they wanted one of their first experiences in Lincoln to include getting this welcome packet that would have a map, a couple publications about conservation and the state of conservation in Lincoln, and it would have this really nice handwritten note from their stewardship manager. That alone we thought was great, so we gave them the funding they were looking for. But over the course of doing that work, they let us know in their grant report that they actually moved away from just sticking those welcome packets in the mail. And instead, they started deliberately setting up times where they could meet those new neighbors face to face and have a conversation. And they wrote to us that they felt like this was a really important way for them to show that Lincoln was, welcoming and inclusive. And I loved the idea of that because it demonstrated that we're not just talking about relationships that have been in place for decades in a community. We're also talking about the potential to form new relationships and to make the circle of people involved in caring about conservation bigger and bigger year over year. And that's really exciting to me. Okay, so speaking of relationship building, it's a really good segue into the final bucket that we want to talk about, being networking. So we already know, and hopefully these examples have demonstrated that the open space committees, they are already so well networked in their own community, and that's why they're such ideal ambassadors for conservation from the perspective of someone like me who works at a land trust. But what we hear over and over again is that open space committees are looking for networking opportunities beyond their town and with practitioners affiliated with state agencies or land trusts. So we're really talking about networking that's happening at different scales. So one example of that, we had an event back in 2018 in Acton, and Sudbury Valley Trustees was the primary land trust partner. ended up having 10 different towns in their region represented. And it was, I think, probably 4 or 5 hours. And the only real cost of the event was the cost of lunch. But from the conversations that I had with people that day, I think every single one of them still would have come to that event, even if they've been asked to bring lunch from home, because they were that enthusiastic about just having a chance to get together. Like, okay, we're in Metro West. What are your challenges? I have that same challenge. How did you get through it? Oh, okay, we didn't try that yet. Like, we're gonna take a cue from you and try that next time with our select board or whatever it may be. So it was really powerful. We continued that work experimenting in the regional approach through some contracts that we were able to grant to 4 great land trust partners a couple years later in 2020. The goal for this project was to figure out, okay, land trust partners within your respective regions, where are the active open space committees? Are there pockets where there's not a committee, but there's interest in forming something like a committee? And if so, how do we support them in that? The people who are active, do we have a way to contact them? Are they interested in being connected with other folks in the region? And of course, a through line through all of this outreach is, what kind of support are they actually looking for? And are we in the position to pull anything together and provide them with that support? So we found that was a very effective strategy. And so each land trust ended up hosting a handful of in-person events. And throughout those events, I think there were 12 in total that happened. These 4 land trusts collectively got 280 people to come out and go to the networking sessions. And when I think about that number, and I have been a lot this week preparing for our conversation today, I mean, just imagining the potential ripple effect if every one of those 280 people has just one meaningful conversation about land protection with a neighbor who trusts them. I mean, to me, that's a complete slam dunk for why we're trying to invest in these conversations, especially at the regional and the local scale. Okay, so we're at this stage now where there's momentum. We just saw our highest ever attendance rate for an open space conference. We have a 65-person wait list for a mapping training. We've got 280 people showing up to talk to open space committees in their region. And every year we're seeing more neighborhood outreach proposals than we can actually fund. So that tells us that the demand for training, funding, networking, all the pieces are there. And what we see is really tying all of that together is this idea of the open space network. And at this point, I think it's fair to say that we've built some of the infrastructure for the network, but it's not fully realized yet. And we keep hearing through evaluations and through conversations that there's a really strong interest in developing a shared sense of identity and in developing that statewide support group for open space committees, just as Massland is that support group for land trusts in Massachusetts. So we've heard over the years that people want a listserv or a database or some other way to communicate with each other between conferences, such as a Facebook page or a website. And we've been able to develop the website, a Facebook page, some other things like that. But what we see is the natural next step in the evolution of the network is hopefully engaging more open space committee members themselves in a leadership role, so that Paul and I and our team can be providing support, but we're not necessarily, driving it. So if there are any of you today who would be interested in helping us think through that, then we'd love to have that conversation with you. Because what we do know at this point is that people like the ones who volunteer at open space committees are critical land protection partners. It doesn't take a lot of funding to get them going and to be doing good outreach work in particular. And our ability to do community conservation work is, of course, rooted in the strength of our relationships with individuals in our communities. This is not rocket science. It's not even new information. In fact, it's probably the most basic thing that we already know. We can't save land if people don't care about it. And if I've learned nothing else in my time working on this grant with Paul, is that there are thousands of people in Massachusetts who do care about this and who are hungry for resources and who have the relationships and are willing to do this work. Paul talked about social capital earlier, and that's really what the Open Space Network is all about, growing and reinforcing. So we are genuinely excited about that. And finally, we just wanted to share this list of resources that we've developed and hope to continue to get into the hands of people like the ones on open space committees who are clearly so poised to take it, run with it, and do great work with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, so much. And Paul, I'm glad you found your way back. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and add a link to the chat where you can give the presenters in MLTC some feedback. But in the meantime, if you have any questions or thoughts or conversations, we have a good chunk of 15 minutes to talk through ideas. I took a whole bunch of notes, really some great ideas. The Catalyst Fund, wow, what a way to get folks. So anybody who wishes to share their thoughts or questions can unmute themselves and we can have a discussion here. If you want, you can put your question in the chat as well, of course, and I will coordinate. People are processing.
Thanks, Lee. You got to get out of the ivory tower once in a while, my friend.
But it's fun here too.
I know, it sure is. But that's it. That's an interesting perspective because you've been so involved in both, you know, through your career to, I guess, to take a little break, so to speak, and then jump back in. I'm glad that you see momentum because you helped build it.
Yeah. I mean, so more participants coming to the Open Space Network, Open Space gatherings, resources.
Lee, can you turn up your volume just a tad, maybe?
I'll just stand closer to it. I don't know if that's better. But yeah, just so many more resources, so many more people coming. Those funding programs were great. The video and that welcome packet. Yeah, just really exciting to hear all that stuff's coming that just haven't been thinking about for a few years.
Yeah, you know, we, as I said in my presentation, you know, Sarah and I and those we're working with, you know, TerraCore member or grad student, you know, we can keep going around and doing workshops, and we do them for landowners. It's our nut and bolts bread and butter piece, but we'll only, you know, you can almost calculate, right? We reach X amount of landowners a year times X amount of years. And so at some point, I think we started thinking about amplifying our impact, not abandoning landowners because they're, you know, they're the ones making the decisions, but how do we have a larger impact? And these groups are just spot on, you know, and they sit in such a great position. And it is frankly embarrassing how much impact they have for $350. I mean, when I consider, I shouldn't say this, but my salary and, you know, like resources I get for publications and things, I like to think I have an impact, but man, you know, if you invest $350 in these well-connected, well-respected, fired up local, you know, folks, they get a lot done. And in fact, we've had the experience where they'll sort of email us and say, yeah, we've got $73 left. You know, we didn't use it all. And these are all the impacts we had. And I'm just sitting there, you know, dazed that they got everything done and had $73 left. So there's a lot of good to be done.
Something that's been circulated, because it'd be great to see what they wrote in that welcome letter. I'm sorry, my sound's not good.
Yeah, that's okay. So I think what I heard you say is it would be good to circulate the welcome letter or other ideas. Yeah. And that's what we hear, to Sarah's point, that's what we continue to hear from folks that we're engaging with. You know, they want to know what other folks have done. They want the example letter. They want the example right of first refusal bylaw. You know, it's all of those resources, and they want to sort of, they want, as Sarah said, a website or a spreadsheet, a searchable database, something that they can access. And I know it would go further. Time is the enemy. I'm sorry, Sarah, I've been gabbing. What would you add?
Nothing. Just a full endorsement of what you just said.
So I've been watching a piece of land that I feel is a very valuable corridor in the city, and I don't know if there would be any interest in trying to preserve it, but and I don't know who it belongs to, but I've been watching it for quite some time. And yesterday I saw killdeer nesting, and they nest there every year. And this is in the city of Waltham, and there was a bluebird there yesterday. I've seen deer there, and so I really would like to see this. It already has stakes in it for something to be built, but I just listened to another conversation, and they said it's never too late. So I would like to see a way, in some way, could see the value of this piece of land as a corridor in a busy city.
Yeah, I think, I don't know the particulars, of course, but I think finding more people like you can be very helpful. Are there others in that neighborhood that, or the city, or those that are walking through there or around there that value it as well, to see if there's some momentum that could be built, or people, that you can voice your interests or your goals. I guess that's one thing that strikes me. I don't know, Sarah or others, what would you say?
There's a tool on the Massland website and a similar one on the Mass Woods website that helps to find a professional. And you may have already done this, Emily, but if you type in your town or your zip code, then it should generate a list of the land trusts that are active. And I don't know that off the top of my head which land trusts are operational in Waltham, but if you haven't already, that could also be really good to reach out, and they might be able to help you figure out who owns the land. Maybe they've heard something about it. Maybe they've also been tracking it.
Actually, I belong with the Waltham Land Trust.
Okay.
And this is just something that I've been watching personally, and I haven't mentioned it to them. They've got a lot of pots on the stove. They're very good at protecting land in Waltham. But to me, every time I see the striking things there, it's in a supermarket area. When I do my grocery shopping, I bird in this area before I go to the grocery store. It's like across the street from the parking lot of the shopping store. And I just keep I saw a river otter nearby with a fish in its mouth. It must have come through the drainage system. That wasn't on the property that I'm looking at. It's the nesting birds and the bluebirds and the eagles and the deer and everything else that I have observed. I'll bring it up with the land trust.
And I don't know if you saw, but Lee put up as a great suggestion of going to Mass Mapper and just seeing if it's been identified as a parcel with significant value. That would be sort of added value. Not that it's not important, but certainly if someone maps it, it takes on a different weight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. We appreciate you coming and hearing about the crazy things Sarah and I have been working on over the last 10 or 12 years as we sort of try to identify these groups and try to, figure out the best strategic way to amplify these impacts and complement, the great work that's happening on, at the state level and regional land trust level, and really complement, that expertise with, the local connections and that relationship piece, because it's a winning combination. There's no question about it. So we appreciate your time.
Well, on behalf of MLTC, I want to say thank you, Sarah and Paul, so much for this presentation.